Today, Indian environmentalist Parno Banerjee said the entire summit was a failure.
We are saying that it's a complete failure. We have failed to agree at a sort of a solution which will lead us to a viable action plan towards controlling climate change. And we believe that it's disastrous for climate. And it's especially disastrous for India's poor and the vulnerable sections, because they are going to be, most severely hit.
For more, I am joined now by Democracy Now! Video stream from Britain by author and Guardian columnist George Monbiot. And joining us here in New York, Lucia Green-Weiskel is with us from the Beijing, China-based organization Innovation Center for Energy and Transportation. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Let's go to George Monbiot. I think we have you on the phone right now. Talk about what happened. Talk about the results of this meeting, if you can call it an accord.
Well, it's a complete disaster. It's not even an accord. There's nothing binding in it. There's no targets and no timetables. And ominously, we now have the head of the UN process, Ivo de Boer, saying we're going to move the talks to Mexico. It will all be fine there. You probably remember this, Amy, but in 2001, the World Trade Talks collapsed in Doha, and the head of the World Trade Organization said, it's all fine, we're going to move the talks to Mexico, and it'll all be resolved then. And they moved to Cancun and were never seen again. And I'm beginning to wonder if Mexico is the diplomatic equivalent of the Pacific garbage patch, the place where failed negotiations go to die. This is a wipeout. It would be hard to conclude that this is not the end of the process, because once you've lost your diplomatic momentum, once the red carpets have been rolled up and the cutlery is being cleared away, it's just very hard to regain it. In fact, I interviewed Ivo de Boer, the man in charge of the process, last year, and I've got a direct quote from him. Very different to what he's saying today, by the way. And he then said, the worst case scenario for me is that climate becomes a second World Trade Organization. Copenhagen for me is a very clear deadline that I think we need to meet, and I'm afraid that if we don't, then the process will begin to slip, and like in the trade negotiations, one deadline after the other will not be met, and we sort of become the little orchestra on the Titanic.
I actually saw Ivo de Boer yesterday in the Copenhagen airport, and I was just standing in front of him. I must say he did not seem very happy, to say the least. I asked him for comment, and he said no, as he eventually heads back to Bonn. But talk about who won here. Talk about President Obama coming into Copenhagen the early morning hours of Friday, and what you understood from there. The way the U.S. media is playing it here in the United States is that he came in, he burst into a private meeting of several countries. I think he was, they said Brazil, India, China, and he said that there has to be transparency, and he demanded an accord. Well,
I can hardly express my disappointment with Mr. Obama. Like many of the world's people, especially those on the liberal and left progressive ends of the spectrum, I placed great hopes in him. He was a man who was a source of inspiration, and I feel incredibly let down and betrayed. What Obama and the US delegation have done this time round is very similar to what George Bush did over Iraq, which was to bypass the United Nations, to go behind the backs of the majority of nations and try to create a coalition of the willing. And in doing so, he effectively trashed the talks. It's absolutely true that the Chinese delegation was being very intransigent and very difficult, but Obama, what he did was to demand that the Chinese delegation change its position without offering anything at all in return. And we all assumed that those of us who are environmentalists who've been following this process assumed that the dreadful US negotiating position was just an opening bid, that the very poor target and very poor timetable offered by the United States was just the bargaining position, and that it would open up from there on. But it soon became clear that there was nothing else on the table, and that Obama was not going to raise that bid, and that while he was demanding that the rest of the world take action, he was not prepared to take any further action himself. And the reason this is such a disappointment is that this was a man who was going to put aside childish things. This is a man who was going to do what was right, not what was expedient. And in this case, he was faced by the greatest challenge the world now confronts, and he was the only man who could break the deadlock. And instead of breaking the deadlock, he ensured that that deadlock became inevitable, and he broke the talks. And we now have a situation where the momentum might never be recovered.
George Monbiot, explain what you mean by he broke the talks.
Well, he just was not prepared actually to negotiate. He was prepared only to demand. He made demands on the other nations, but he didn't offer anything in return, and that's not negotiation. That's just gunboat diplomacy. And unless you are prepared to offer something in return, all you can do is to humiliate the other side. And of course, the Chinese in particular are very sensitive to humiliation. And losing face is a very, very big thing in China. And the way Obama laid it on the line to them, it was do as I say, or the whole thing collapses, rather than if you do this, I'll do that, and we'll have a deal. There was no deal making being done. All it was just this brutal demand. And I can understand that if it was coming from the Bush presidency. It's much harder to understand coming from the Obama presidency.
And explain exactly what the demand was.
Well, the demand was that China open itself up to